Welcome to Wisdom for the Wilderness, a weekly podcast of Overland Church where the pastors of Overland discuss biblical and theological topics as well as current cultural issues. And what we're going to do today is try to provide wisdom for us to walk in the wilderness that we live in, the wilderness of the world. Hey, I just want to say real quick, thank you so much for listening. We've gotten a lot of good feedback. And so if you're finding these helpful, will you be sure to hit like and subscribe and to share them with your friends and people that you think that this might help them in their daily life as they live out really a world that we really need a lot of wisdom for. So today we've got kind of a fun topic, I think. One, because it's an ancient topic that has been brought back up in recent years, and that is the idea of Sabbath.
Yeah.
And so, I don't remember 10 years ago anybody ever asking me the question, do you take a Sabbath?
Yeah, I would probably agree on that. I mean, obviously in Sunday school, we were talking about the 10 Commandments. We talked about the Sabbath, but what to do with that and kind of the theology of it and a practice of it, that wasn't as much on the radar. And maybe that was because we, growing up in the South, it was just assumed that Sunday was a time of rest. Like you didn't have sports on Sunday.
Right.
None of those things were happening on that day of the week.
Yeah, maybe that's it. But I do know that in recent years, there has been some popular teaching on the Sabbath. And I think with that, it's resounded with a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's resounded with a lot of people because, well, we're in a hurry. And do you remember that old Alabama song? I'm in a hurry
to get things done.
Yeah.
I rush and rush, and now life's no fun.
All I want to do is live and die, and I'm in a hurry and don't know why. We didn't talk about that beforehand. I just felt sure that if it's 1990s country, he would know it.
Alabama is the best country group of all time.
Do you know that if you say the word Alabama to my kids, they spit? They hate Alabama, but that's because the football team, not because of the band. And so anyway, when this idea of Sabbath comes up, and I think the teachers that were bringing it out, I mean, they're bringing it out for a reason. They're bringing it out because they saw that, hey, what we're doing, the pace in which we're running life isn't healthy.
Right.
And things have gone awry here. I mean, they've gone off the rails in a lot of ways. And so in my thinking, and tell me if you think this is true, there are really kind of two extremes. You've got people who are living life at such a high pace. They're crazy busy. I mean, it's one thing to the next. They're rushing from one thing to the next. Like that is an extreme of people. And then there's another extreme that's like there's a laziness about them. They're a sluggard.
Yeah.
And most everybody else is in between.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And but on the one hand, a lot of people in their jobs, especially since COVID, there has been a push from their employer not to turn off at any moment.
Ooh,
and with Slack and messaging and working from home, that's given some margin, but that's actually probably taken more margin away for people than anything.
Because psychologically, you always have to be on.
Right.
And when you hear, when you hear that message alert go off, your Microsoft Teams or whatever, for a lot of people, it creates I'm working all the time, even though your actual productivity and the actual number of hours that you're working may be less than it was before.
Yeah.
But I think, that 90% in the middle, and 90% of people out there, like there's a lot of wisdom that's going to be able to take away from this conversation. I think what I've seen is that a lot of the people who gravitate towards the idea of Sabbath, and I just throw this out there. There's a book called Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. Have you read that book?
I've not read it.
Okay. I've not read it either. I've listened to it, and I listened to it on 1.5 speed while driving probably speeding 5 to 10 miles an hour.
That's hypocrisy
over the speed limit.
Listening to that book, that's hypocrisy, right?
You know, it's the only way. It's the only way I was going to listen. I'm not going to read that book. It's the only way I'm going to listen to it. So, you know, books have to have a certain, for me to read the book, and I read quite a bit.
Yeah,
but it has to have a certain level of importance to it,
right,
and weight to it. And I want to read authors and scholars that I like value everything they have to say. Yeah. So I'm just not going to read that book. But a lot of people who gravitated to those kind of ideas, I feel like tend towards laziness and sluggardness.
Yeah.
And the people who are on the other extreme, they aren't going to give that book the time of day. And maybe I just put myself in that other extreme, but I'm really not.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm in that extreme. I'm really not. But I think everybody else in between, like there is definitely something for us to take away. To the person who just like goes, I love it, and uses it as an excuse, I just want to say, like, get to work.
Right. Yeah.
I think a lot of people do get it wrong, and they're getting this idea of rest wrong and Sabbath wrong. We'll talk about that. I want to lay out what Sabbath was in the Old Testament, what it was in the New Testament. But let me just tell you kind of an anecdotal story. When we first started our church, we're getting ready to launch. It was January of 2019. And we have an incredible story at our church. A church died, Southside Baptist Church died. Their last service was December 30th, 2018, and we were going to launch January 27th, 2019. So we had less than a month to get that building ready. And so there were a number of us on our church plant team that we were at that church 14, 15 hours a day from December 30th to January 27th. I mean, a few of us really put in the hours. We had a college student that showed up to serve one day. It was like a Wednesday. It's probably like January 5th or 6th. I mean, it's early on in the month. So college isn't in.
Right.
And they worked on campus, so they didn't have to work at campus either.
Yeah.
And so this person worked, and she worked like 3 or 4 hours, and she was leaving, and she goes, hey, I won't be back tomorrow, but I'll be back the next day. Tomorrow I'm going to Sabbath. Uh-huh. And I said, really? And it would have been like a Wednesday or a Thursday.
Right.
And that was odd to me. Like, I'm gonna Sabbath.
Just choose this random day. To be a Sabbath.
A Sabbath, right? And so I'm thinking, okay, what's this like? So that she comes back 2 days later, and I said, so hey, how did your Sabbath go? What did you do? I'm curious. And she goes, well, I slept in. I slept in. I was like, so what's that mean? What's sleeping into you mean?
Right.
I slept till like 10 or 11 o'clock. I mean, almost to lunch. Oh, okay. And then I got up, and I just had like a real nice, easy morning. I made breakfast. I had avocado toast, and I'm like stereotype there.
Right.
That's pretty funny. And I did my quiet time, and I read the Bible and sat and reflected. I meditated. I said, so how long, what'd you read, And, it was like, I don't know, a chapter in the book of Luke.
Right. What most of us read normally, every day at least.
And how long I sat silent for 10 minutes, yeah? And then, like a little bit later it comes out that then the rest of the day was spent in binge watching Netflix in the pajamas. And I'm going,
and you call that a Sabbath? That's
not a Sabbath.
Yeah.
That's a lazy day.
Yes.
That's what that is.
Uh-huh.
So, I am very much in this place where I believe that just like those guys who brought up Sabbath and were teaching on it and the problems they solve, I see the problem.
Right.
Let's just make sure we're getting the solution right.
Yeah.
So let's do this, Josh. In the Old Testament, what was the Sabbath?
So actually, people would be a little surprised by this, that the Sabbath is not mentioned in Genesis. So in Genesis, there's 6 days of creation. On the seventh day, God rests from all the work he had done. But the word Sabbath, the concept of Sabbath, is not there. It only says that God consecrated the seventh day and made it holy. But we don't have any mentioning of any of the patriarchs or anybody in the book of Genesis keeping a Sabbath day. The institution of the Sabbath does not come until Exodus 20 in the law, in the Ten Commandments.
Right.
And part of the justification for that in Exodus is that God rested on that seventh day. But it's just there needs to be a kind of a distinction. This practice of the Sabbath is coming under the Sinai covenant, under the Mosaic law.
Over the Mosaic law.
It's not. It has a basis in creation, but it's not a creation command. And it does not seem to have been practiced before the Sinai covenant. So I think that's a good place to start. Be carefully looking at the text and seeing when does this command come about?
Right.
Yeah.
So it comes about. We see it in the Ten Commandments.
Yes.
At Sinai. What was God's purpose in giving them this Sabbath?
So Exodus 31:13 says that the Sabbath day is a sign of the Mosaic covenant. So just like the rainbow is a sign of the Noahic covenant, and there's other signs of different covenants to represent the relationship of the people with God in that covenant, the Sabbath is one of the signs of the Sinai covenant. It is one of the ways that Israel looks distinct from the nations around it by having this day devoted to resting. Now, what's interesting is that in the Old Testament, there is no explicit connection of the Sabbath day with worship. There is explicit connection of the Sabbath day with resting from your regular labors.
Right.
And it's a sign of, what is this a sign of? It's a sign of their relationship and trust in God, right?
It's about a dependency.
Right, yes.
So you're saying in a time and a culture where you're living, you're eating, your welfare depended on your manual labor.
Right.
So you are saying, I'm going to take a day off and trust that the Lord is going to provide.
Yes. And there's not just the Sabbath day, there's also the Sabbath years.
Right.
And then bringing that full cycle to the year of Jubilee, where there are entire years you're not planting and you're trusting in that sixth year, God is going to give you 3 years worth of harvest.
Right.
I mean, think about that. That's like incredible trust in the God of the covenant, that despite everything the way it looks, in this sixth year, he's going to give me enough for 3 years until we start planting again to take this 1 year off. And you have that also in the giving of the manna, right?
Right. That's what I was about to bring up, was just like their daily life at the time of receiving this covenant, like their daily life had a very, just in front of them expression of this, that they couldn't take and store manna back.
Right.
You couldn't put it on the shelf. It would spoil. Like they were dependent on God every day for their manna. Manna. Did you ever have, what's his name? TJ
Betts.
TJ Betts.
Yes.
I just remember him telling a story about manna, and it's like, what is it? And so if he's ever at a potluck at church and somebody gives him something and he doesn't know what it is or doesn't know what it tastes like, he just smiles and says, "Oh, tastes like manna." What is it? But what is it? We don't know what it was. Some sort of bread, we assume, and then quail eggs.
Yeah.
Were the other piece of that. And of course they went and they struck a rock and water would come out. I mean, we see these like great movements of God, and that's what they're trusting.
Right.
So, you bring up the Old Testament and just think about like when you're reading. We've been at church. We've just gone through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. We've been these stories of the kings. Like a Sabbath, as you think about the Sabbath, wasn't a big part of what they were doing. When you read the prophets, you don't necessarily see that. You do see the Sabbath in the prophets. I'm not saying you don't see them, like you see it in Nehemiah, you see it in different places. But when you come to the New Testament, you see this real legalism
right
around the Sabbath.
Yeah.
That you don't necessarily read the same sort of legalism and practice in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and the Pharisees' perspective is a result of the exile in the Old Testament. The nation of Israel has failed to keep the law, and therefore the kingdom of God did not come. And so their perspective is we have to enforce the law in the nation in order to bring the kingdom about. And so this is why they're the sticklers who are like, well, you ripped the grain off and popped it in your mouth, you're working, or Jesus is healing, that's working. Because from their perspective, if the nation of Israel does not take God's law seriously, then God's kingdom will not come.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So at sundown on Friday night,
Right,
till sundown on Saturday night, that's what was considered the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And so in the New Testament, again, I mean, worship was very much a daily thing, going to the temple daily, doing stuff daily. So it was about not working. It wasn't not necessarily about worship.
Yeah, although in that period, that's when the connection with worship is created. So they would begin going to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. But it's also important that the Sabbath day was not the only day that they would go to the synagogue, but it was kind of the day because everybody's not working, that kind of like everybody is going to be there that day.
And, you know, if you fast forward to certain places, Orthodox Jews, today, they would want to live within a certain distance of a synagogue.
Right.
Because if they walk or travel too far to the synagogue, it's considered working, right?
Yes.
And so
yes.
You've got to live close to a synagogue. You got to get there. And, you know, there's all these rules that come, modern day rules, where, like, if you go to a hotel in Israel, you don't even press the button to tell it what floor you're on the Sabbath. It stops literally at every floor on the way up because you can't even touch that. I mean, there's the legalism that has come around it within Judaism is just wild, and it was in Jesus's day. So what happens to the Sabbath when Jesus comes?
Yeah, so Paul, I think, makes it most clear in Romans, but I'm going to focus on Galatians, that the law was a temporary guardian that prepared us for the coming of Christ. So as Christians, we are not under the law of Moses as a covenant that's governing our relationship with God. So there are portions of that law that are creation principles, that are wisdom, that are going on forever and ever with every. I mean, do not murder.
Right.
Like that's not something that's limited to the law of Moses.
Right.
That's all the way back to Genesis chapter 4, where Cain murders Abel.
Right. Adultery.
Yeah. But there are certain aspects that, especially these signs of the covenant, that do not continue to govern our relationship with God because we're not under that covenant. And the three main ones in the Jewish life was circumcision, the food laws, and the Sabbath. That's what marked them out as distinct from, at that period, from the Greco-Roman culture around them.
Right. And so, and those three things were abolished with the new covenant of Jesus, with the gospel. All three of those things are abolished.
Yeah. And so what Paul has to do very carefully in his letters is he has to kind of mediate between the Jewish group of people in these churches and the Gentile groups, because a lot of the Jewish people are still following these traditions, whereas he doesn't want the Gentiles to be put under expectation to follow these things. So, you know, one passage that we could turn to that I think is really helpful is Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, where it says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ."
Okay.
So he's telling them, you shouldn't judge one another in the church as to whether or not you practice the Sabbath, because that was just a shadow pointing forward to Jesus and the rest that he would give us.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we see another transition happen here, that the Christian church is not practicing the Sabbath. They're not,
Right.
all of a sudden, they're not, stopping their work at sundown on Friday. They're worshiping on the Lord's Day,
Yes.
which is Sunday. And so this transition happens because now we're going to worship on the first day of the week.
Right.
We're giving it's kind of like saying we're giving our first fruits, the first day of the week, the best thing we have.
Yeah.
And that's Sunday,
Right.
for us.
Yeah.
So
and it's also signifies that Jesus was raised on the first
day of the week. That's right. The day he was risen,
which is connecting you back to Genesis, that this is now the beginning of a new creation.
right?
And so we are not operating within the old creation and focusing on God on the seventh day. We are now belonging to a new creation. So the Lord's Day is the first day. That's the day of worship. And we have examples of this in the New Testament and also outside the New Testament, that they gathered for worship on Sunday, the first day of the week.
So as this idea of taking a Sabbath has become popular in recent years, and this isn't the only time that it's become popular. It's just been a very funny expression of it.
Right.
It's bringing up some ancient past, and even those guys who are bringing that up, they're somewhat monastics, right? And monasticism. If you think monk, a monk was a monastic. They would be totally set apart. They would go and live a secluded life in worship and reflection. You see a lot of that happen in Buddhism and other religions, right? So there's these religious extremists, right? And so some of the guys who are pushing this idea of this modern Sabbath, they've got some very monastic influences in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you and I are definitely more missionary than monastic, right? So more missionary than monk.
Yeah.
We would have a conviction that we should be living our life with purpose out in the world, but not of the world.
Right. Yeah. And I wouldn't want to go, so far that those kind of practices. I mean, we talked in our last podcast about quiet time and being in the Bible and prayer.
Incredibly important.
Having those devoted times are very important to our spiritual life, but ultimately it's not just for, another country song. Me and Jesus have our own thing going.
Okay.
It's not for us to just kind of look inward. It's for us to spend time with Christ and then be sent out in the power of the Spirit, to proclaim him in the world and live in the world as his witnesses and ambassadors.
Right. So, that I want to have this conversation around. So what does that look like? What would it look like for us in a healthy way to say, okay, how do we evaluate Sabbath and apply it? But let's just look at church history.
Right.
And let's see how church history applied it.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the confessions that I read and have enjoyed is the 1689 London Baptist Confession.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a lot of that confession that I'm that's what I believe.
Right.
But then when we get to the section of Sabbath, I'm actually I actually don't follow this in church history. The seminary that you and I went to has the abstract of principles.
Right.
I think most professors who sign that abstract of principles don't hold to what it says about Sabbath. I think they hold practically everything else.
Right.
But they go, so you've got a copy there.
Yeah.
I believe it's section 22, the 7th and 8th paragraph.
Right. Yeah, and just to note that the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession is taking all these things, this section at least, directly from the Westminster Confession. So it's almost word for word, if not word for word, the Presbyterian Westminster Confession at this point. But you want me to read the whole thing?
Yeah, let's just start with paragraph 7, and then let's do paragraph 8.
So it is the law of nature, this is in modern English, that in general a portion of time specified by God should be set apart for the worship of God, so that by his word, in a positive, moral, and perpetual commandment that obligates everyone in every age, he has specifically appointed one day in 7 for a Sabbath to be kept holy to him. From the beginning of the world to the resurrection of Christ, the appointed day was the last day of the week. After the resurrection of Christ, it was changed to the first day of the week, which is called the Lord's Day. This day is to be kept to the end of the age as the Christian Sabbath, since the observance of the last day of the week has been abolished.
Okay, so we see very much of the things that we were talking about there.
Yeah, you see they're basing it in nature and creation, that God has made us to need a day of rest, and I actually wouldn't have any problem with that.
anything, nothing that was just said there.
Well,
I mean,
the problem I have is when they claim that the Sabbath day was changed to the Lord's Day.
I see what you're saying. I got you. Gotcha.
Yeah, because that's not said in the New Testament. The Lord's Day is not put forward as a substitute or the changing of the Sabbath. And even in early Christian history, they're not saying the Lord's Day is a new Sabbath. In fact, there's a lot of contrasting the Sabbath versus the Lord's Day.
Right.
And you have this one heretical group in early Christianity called the Ebionites, which are Jewish people trying to follow the law of Moses but claim Jesus as the Messiah. And they actually practice both the Sabbath on Saturday and the Lord's Day on Sunday.
And now we get the weekend off.
Yeah. So for them, you see, they're not equating the Lord's Day as a new Sabbath.
Got it.
This perspective does not come about until medieval times.
Gotcha.
And then comes into the Reformation from medieval times.
Got it.
Yeah.
Right. So then this next part kind of shows how they live this out.
Right.
In paragraph 8. So read paragraph 8.
The Sabbath is kept holy to the Lord when people have first prepared their hearts appropriately and arranged their everyday affairs in advance. Then they observe a holy rest all day from their own works, words, and thoughts about their secular employment and recreation. Not only that, but they also fill the whole time with public and private acts of worship and the duties of necessity and mercy.
All right. So now that paragraph shows you all these people who are talking about practicing a Sabbath.
Right.
They're not doing that.
Yeah, they're actually using it for recreation most of the time.
Right.
But, they're not viewing the Lord's Day as their Sabbath totally devoted to worship from the time you get up to the time you go to bed.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying that nobody is doing that, because some of the guys who are writing and preaching this stuff, that is what they are. Yeah. They have in mind. So how many Sabbatarians do you know?
One.
I think it's the same one.
Yes.
And it's one of our professors, a professor that you and I both love, and his name's Jim Scott Orrick, and maybe he'll hear this one day. I kind of doubt it. I kind of doubt he's going to listen to our podcast.
He listens to podcasts.
I don't think so either. But he's really the only Sabbatarian that I know, someone who actually practices the Sabbath. Now, I do believe some of these guys writing about this are, but let me just tell you what this means for him as a Sabbatarian. Their whole Sunday, from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed, is devoted to some form of worship and rest.
Yeah.
So they will go to church as a family. Whether they're serving in nursery or they're serving in some way, they consider their serving a part of their giving to the Lord, their Sabbath. They sit in worship, the songs they sing, it's all part of them practicing the Sabbath. They would go home, no going anywhere else. They would go home. I don't know if they prepare a meal beforehand, or if they prepare a meal, but they would eat that meal as a family, and then there's no like recreation. There's no watching NFL. There's no watching basketball. There's no reading secular books.
Yeah.
It would be taking naps, which I like a Sunday afternoon nap. Don't hear me wrong. I'll get that wrong.
I can hardly stop myself. It's like ingrained in me.
To take a Sunday, yeah. They would only read the Bible or books about the gospel or about Christian books, and then probably go back to church on Sunday night.
Yeah, or have some sort of family worship, or something like
some sort of family worship.
Yeah,
and so someone who says, "Yeah, I'm a Sabbatarian," that's what that looks like.
Right. And there's a lot of that I actually would agree with. I just wouldn't call it the Sabbath. I think the principle of the Lord's Day in the New Testament is that we are setting apart a portion, at least, of this day for worship, and we're going to guard that as Christians, so that it's only in extreme cases of ill health, or if you have a job that you just cannot control the schedule, or you're traveling in some unusual situation, that you're going to miss the Lord's Day, that you're going to guard that day as a portion that you're giving to the Lord. Right.
So would you watch like a basketball game on a Sunday afternoon?
On a Sunday afternoon, I don't think you have to dedicate the entire day like that. And we had in the fall, JJ played fall ball.
Right.
And so he would have a baseball game on Sunday afternoon. I had no problem with that. There was times where the game was starting before we were done at church, and we just told the coach we're not going to be there until church is done.
Right.
But that portion of the day that's dedicated to worship, we're going to be there, and we're not going to just say, "Oh, we need to sleep in today," or "I'm not feeling it," or we want, it's a pretty day, so we're going to go to the lake or whatever.
Right. No, you're saying this is a day that's marked, and so that would be the difference. Like a Sabbatarian is somewhat like a level of legalism about it, maybe.
Right.
Where we're not saying that, but we are saying there's just a really high priority on worshiping the Lord on the Lord's Day with the body of Christ. Yeah. That we are not forsaking the gathering together of the
and I
assembly.
don't think you would be saying that Dr. Orrick is a legalist in any way.
No, I've actually broken the law with him before. Long story, but no,
but
no, not
but
in any way.
But it can tend that Sabbatarianism can tend towards a legalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if it's not focused with the right priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how do we take how do we transition from, all right, here's kind of where we go in the conversation. Here's where it's kind of been presented that we should take a Sabbath. There's hustle, there's bustle, there's the craziness and chaotic part of life. So we desire this. Yeah. We see what it was in the Old Testament. We see what it was in the New Testament. Now talking about, the 1689 confession, we see what it was like in church history. Mm-hmm. What should it be like for us now?
I think we're not saying that as a creature you don't have limitations. I mean, that's absolutely biblical. Like, you cannot work and keep going at a high level 7 days a week nonstop. That's not possible. You need rest.
Yeah, I knew some guys when I was in my 20s and worked in a factory. I knew these guys. They worked 7 12s.
Wow.
7 12s. They and it was so rare that they took a day off.
Yeah.
And there would be two guys on the same machine, right? So one would work 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Uh-huh. The other one would work 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And multiple times the company tried to get them to go to 3 shifts, and those two guys didn't want it because they wanted the money.
Yeah.
And can I tell you something?
What?
They looked horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, they were always dragging, their bags under their eyes, hair falling out.
Especially the night shift guy.
The night shift guy looked, he did. His last name was Savage, and he was no savage at all. I mean, he had worked himself way out of being a savage.
Yeah.
But why did they do it? And it was agreed that did, and they had nothing. They could do nothing else with their life.
Right. Yeah. And so I don't disagree with that as a principle of creation.
Right,
We have limitations that God doesn't, and that it's also an act of trust that God, you're going to take care of me. Everything's going to be fine if I turn the phone off, if I unplug for a little bit. That's fine. And as pastors, the pastoral practice generally is to take a day of the week off because Sunday is a tough day for us. I don't always do it. I don't know if you always do it. I know you have a date on Fridays, and I generally have a date on Fridays.
Yeah, Jennifer and I take a lunch date, which I guard Fridays. I sermon prep in the morning.
Yeah,
we take a lunch date. Yeah, I'm not. I take days off, but I'm not a no days off kind of guy. But there are seasons where I really, really hustle.
Yeah,
and there are seasons where I'll work 40 and 50 days in a row without taking off. Yeah. And then there's other, I make it up. We go on vacation. We rest. I unplug. I go to the mountains. We hike. We hunt. We do those things. Those things are important.
But we're not saying those things are Sabbath. And I think that it's wrong for people to claim they're Sabbathing when they're taking a day off. That's exactly right.
It's fine. So here's where I would just come with this. How we order our life matters, and how we structure our life matters, and what we do with our time tells us how much we trust God.
Right.
And so, we've got a lot of different people in our church in different situations. I would just tell you this. I would tell you to try to order your life in such a way that you cannot do your job on Sunday, your primary job on Sunday. Order your life in such a way where you have margin. If you're having to work seven days a week in order to make ends meet, there's either a couple problems. Either you're living beyond your means,
right,
and you've got too much debt. You've bought things that you cannot afford. You're having to do these things, or you need to work on your profession and your skill, and you need to be in a different job.
Yeah.
So, I'm not saying that everybody in every season won't have to work on Sunday or won't have to work 7 days a week.
There's certain profession. I used to pastor a lot of farmers, and there's certain seasons that they're working on Sunday afternoon.
Right, their ox is in a ditch.
Yeah, and accountants at tax time.
Yeah, we've got accountants at church that they'll be at church on Sunday morning, and they're going to go home, and by probably 12:30, 1 o'clock, during tax season, they're working on taxes.
Yeah, my dad works swing shift at a factory. He has no control over that schedule. It's factory wide.
Right.
But, even in that, he's got, like at least half the month that he's not working on a Sunday.
Right.
And so, you have to make that priority in your life regularly. And, there are certain situations. But I think more people make excuses than are actually in those situations.
Right. There's in the ordering of your life, really, if you should be taking care of your work and creating the margin in your work so that you can be home. And I'm not just talking about for Sunday. I'm talking about during, in the evening or in the morning, depending what shift you work. And again, we got people in a lot of different situations. I mean, somebody who works at Wendy's is going to have a lot less control of their calendar than someone who's working for Otterbox in our town, right? They're going to have more control. I'm just saying that the aim and your goal should be able to work yourself into a position that you have margin in your life.
Yes.
In this hustle and bustle, that you're evaluating your life and going, hey, is everything I'm doing worth it?
In the same way that in finances, if you're not able to give the Lord a tithe of your finances, then you've got to evaluate, where's all this money going, and what are the priorities in my life that are taking priority over the Lord. And that same thing is happening with your week, with your time.
Yeah, that's a great word. I mean, and it goes back to, again, it's trusting that the Lord will provide enough for you. And I would just tell you, in our culture, I think most individuals that really work hard, they can work hard in 40 to 60 hours a week, and that you can make ends meet. There are very few people in our culture that would need to work beyond that. You want to create the amount of margin to be able to serve your church. One of our elders had moved up in his position at church. Is Randy Kenyon. You can talk to Randy about this. He had moved up. He was in his job. He's climbed the ladder, but he's required to travel. He's busy. He's working incredibly hard. He's feeling like, listen, I don't have enough time to serve in my church. I don't have enough time for my family. I'm starting to have grandkids. I don't just want to work all the time.
Right.
So what's he do? But he changes jobs. He takes a lower position in order to be able to fulfill the mission that God has given him. And some of us just need to examine our life and think through that and order our life in that way. So as we kind of finish up today, what would be your advice to us today? What would be your wisdom?
I would say the most important rest that you need is worship. Don't view those as two different things. That's why the Lord's Day is the priority that it is. It's worship is a type of rest. It takes, getting ready and getting the kids in the car and going somewhere and all these things. And physically, maybe it's not as restful as sitting at home and binging on Netflix. But the spiritual rest that it's going to give you in Christ for your week, that's what God is prescribing for us. And I think that's what actually goes back to Genesis. When God finishes on the seventh day and he rests from the works he's done, God is not binging on Netflix. God is not resting from labor.
Right.
Jesus says he's still working until now. It's a rest of coming to rest in his creation to be worshiped by Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And that's the type of rest that's the most important rest for us, is not recreation, but rest in worship.
Yeah. I would say this, just in closing, get enough sleep at night, every night. So create enough margin in your life that you're able to go to bed, that you're free from distractions and able to go to bed. Make sure that you're spending time with the Lord every day, that you're reading his word, you're praying, right? And then work hard.
Yeah.
I laugh at the college girl who's like, yeah, I'm taking a Sabbath. And I'm like, shouldn't you work 6 days first? Like, work hard. Go to work and work hard. Work hard with your family.
Yes.
To minister to your family. Do those things. Life is but a vapor. Spend your time doing what's going to matter in a million years.
Yes.
And so, yes, rest, but then rest in order to work, to do the mission and the work that God has given you to do. Man, thank you so much for joining Wisdom for the Wilderness today. Again, if this was helpful for you, would you share this? Be sure to like and subscribe. And man, I hope to see you in person worshiping on this Lord's Day. God bless and take care.